Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming events.
Rebecca Makkai is the author of the novels I Have Some Questions for You, The Great Believers, The 100-Year House, and The Borrower, and the story collection Music for Wartime. A finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, The Great Believers received an American Library Association Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, among other honors, and was named one of the 10 books of 2018 by New York Times. A 2022 Guggenheim Fellow, Makkai is the artistic director of StoryStudio Chicago. She lives on the campus of the Midwestern boarding school where her husband teaches and in Vermont. And then joining her in conversation is Katy Yocom, who was born and raised in Atchison, Kansas. After earning her degree in journalism from the University of Kansas, she moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where she has lived ever since. Her novel, 3 Ways to Disappear, won the Siskiyou Prize for New Environmental Literature, Philip H. McMath Post-Publication Book Award as well. It was named a Barnes & Noble top indie favorite. She lives with her family in Louisville and serves as the Associate Director of the Low Residency MFA of the Naslund Mann Graduate School of Writing at Spalding University. And I'll just leave you with a quick review of Rebecca Makkai's book, I Have Some Questions for You. The New York Times Book Review calls I Have Some Questions for You a spellbinding work. Makkai's prose is lean, yet lush, with short incantory chapters and sentences as taut as piano wire. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our 2 authors. Thank you.
All right. Hello, everyone. Hello, Rebecca.
Hello.
It is so exciting to be up here on stage with you.
I'm thrilled to be here.
Welcome to Louisville.
Yeah.
So welcome to the library. Welcome to Carmichael's world. And so it's wonderful to see all these faces in the audience, too. So I just want to, if you don't mind, just dive in a little bit right into this book and just talk a little bit about kind of give the setup and talk about what's happening here. And then I'm hoping you'll read for us a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I announced this book kind of just on my social media and so on, I called it a literary feminist boarding school murder mystery, which is correct. But the basic story here is we have this woman, Bodie Kane. She's 40. She's a film historian, and she has a very successful podcast about film history. And she's invited just for 2 weeks in the dead of winter, invited back to the boarding school in New Hampshire that she had attended as an adrift teenager to teach a couple classes, one on film history, one on podcasting. And while she's back there, her mind is, of course, on the past, on the mid-90s when she graduated, but very specifically on the death of a young woman her senior year. This young woman was found dead in the campus swimming pool, but with significant injuries to her body. And there's a young man who is an athletic trainer at the school, a young black man named Omar, who's been in prison for the crime most of that time. Since then, there are a lot of people online who believe he is innocent. And one of Bodie's podcasting students is among them and wants to do her podcast on this case, which she feels was incorrectly solved. Bodie herself has never really re-examined the case, but gets very quickly drawn in, and we go from there.
And it's such an interesting setup. I think anyone who kind of Googles you has probably seen that you live at a boarding school, that it was your, in fact, alma mater.
Yeah.
That you live there now. So that gives us a little insight into why you wanted to write a boarding school mystery. But if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Well, it's interesting because I almost have the exact opposite experience where I barely left the school where I went versus this person who's been gone, never has come back, and then finally comes back. The reason I live there is that my husband teaches there. So I went away to, I was a day student. I was a scholarship day student at this boarding school near Chicago. I went away to college, met my husband in grad school, and he was a high school English teacher. And I dragged him back to Chicago, and this school is where he got the job. And when you teach at a boarding school, you usually live on campus. So we've been living on campus for more than 20 years at my high school. It's not that unusual within the boarding school world because you got a lot of teachers who are alumni of those schools. In my case, I don't teach there, but I do live there. And I actually have nothing at all to do with the students. So whatever you're picturing about the facts of life or what it is not that. I'm not employed by the school in any way, but it's been an amazing place to raise my kids, and my oldest daughter is a sophomore now. It's a setting that has always fascinated me. I've always had friends asking, are you ever going to write a boarding school novel? And my initial answer was like, maybe after my husband is retired, so nobody thinks it's about them. But then I went ahead and did it anyway, and hopefully I think anyone affiliated with that school would understand immediately that this is not that school in any way. But it's a fascinating environment. It's a closed system, right? It's a closed circuit. And you're also talking about, not only are people kind of isolated sometimes, as in this case, really in the woods, but it's also at this really raw, vulnerable, formative time of life, kind of really different than the college campus novel, I think. And then there were a lot of other things that actually led me into the story. There are a lot of other elements there that I'm sure we'll talk about. But as a setting, it's also a setting that I think people tend to get wrong a lot. The depictions that you see in books or on film really tend to overly romanticize that setting. Like it's always October. Like the leaves are always orange. Things like that, and then also things that kind of are actively gotten wrong. This depiction of these places being entirely really, really privileged students. And while it's a privilege to go to a school like that, there's actually a modern school like that. There's the same kind of very responsible diversity, socioeconomic, among other kinds, that you would see in a really good small liberal arts college. And that's not the kind of thing that gets depicted, right? So there was a little bit of like, I'd love to set the record straight, among other things.
Yeah. So you told the New York Times that the joy and tragedy of the passage of time is one of the things that moves you most in literature. And I wanted to ask you about that, about memory, but also about creating a murder mystery. Yeah. And I'm just interested to see how those things kind of combine for you. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Definitely, and they are really related. Most of my work is, at least in some way, thematically concerned with that, the layers of time, the layers of history, the passage of time. And the thing about quote unquote murder mystery, it's not that I have nothing against it, but I was not interested really in the genre of the murder mystery. Mm-hmm. That's not why I was writing this. It was not to partake in that genre. There are certain genres that are only genres, like the vampire story, only a genre, not a real thing, right? Versus like a love story. Well, that could be the romance novel genre, but we also have love stories in real life. And murder actually is one of those things, right? You could have this genre of the Agatha Christie style murder mystery or other kinds. But in real life, far too frequently, we have some kind of tragedy that's happened that someone's responsible for. And we are then in the position of looking at this and trying to figure out what already happened here in the past. Mm-hmm. And in most cases, we are really unable to figure that out. Maybe we'll know parts of it, but we won't know all of it. And worst case scenario, we get that very wrong, and the wrong person is imprisoned for that. That is, to me, I'm more interested with something like that passage of time than I am with, I'm going to write a, capital M murder mystery. It's much more about, how do we know the past? How do we know our own past? We don't accurately remember our own past, even these really formative times like high school. We think we do, and we get it wrong. But then especially when the stakes are so high, it's not just, hey, do you remember that guy? Oh, I thought his name was this. It's like, we need to know what happened. And possibly many decades later, need to come back together and talk again about what do you remember from high school on this one day, which is nearly impossible. So I'm glad you asked about those in connection to each other, because that for me, I think that, every novel is asking questions that the reader is reading to find out the answers to, right? And if those are questions about the future, like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? We call that suspense. When those are questions about the present, we might call that intrigue, or we might call that philosophy, depending what kind of questions those are. When those are questions about the past and what already happened here, that's when we tend to call it mystery. But the nature of those questions, of course, is going to change depending on the time frame. That question of memory coming into play is what's really fascinating for me there. And so not all of my work is about looking at the past, but there's very often some kind of layering of time periods or of history or looking back in some way.
Right, we saw that in The Great Believers.
Yeah, which was back and forth between two time periods, yeah.
That's really interesting. It was so interesting to me that you chose two really fabulous moments for the main time periods for this book. The current day time is set mostly in 2018 in the immediate aftermath of the Me Too era. And you're looking back on 1995, so right before kind of the entire world changes with the internet, with everyone having a cell phone. Talk a little bit about what drew you to those moments, and especially the juxtaposition of the two.
So 1995, so Bodhi is absolutely not me. I have very little in common with this character, but I did give her my high school graduation year. It made things a lot easier, for one thing. Like, what were we listening to? What were we wearing? How did we talk? I didn't have to research, was not hard. I pulled out my old yearbooks. That was about the extent of my research. It also, though, was a really interesting watershed moment. Like, I got my first email address on my first day of college in the fall of 1995. So for me, high school was before the internet, college was the internet. And it turned out to, I hadn't actually given that much thought to that before I wrote this book. But then, of course, thinking about it a lot in relation to this book, this plot line, or this plot, and the idea that the way information spread in the early 90s was so different. And I needed to have this situation where Bodhi, who's a very, very smart person, had not really looked into all of the details of this case and what happened, or at least largely because this is an era when she's going to be getting sent literal newspaper clippings. So fall of 95, yes, we had email, but that's not how everyone's communicating yet, right? You cannot go and Google the case and watch this online, figure out. So she's just got this kind of real secondhand, thirdhand information that people were much more likely to take as the truth. Here's the newspaper, this is what it says. So that ended up being really, really interesting. Also, just their sense of isolation in the woods there. The school that I went to was really not that isolated. We were a little bit in the woods, but like 30 minutes from Chicago, so not that isolated, but I have, these kids are deep in the woods in New Hampshire, and, to give them only the payphones in the dorm as their way of reaching the outside world felt like a real compression that I could put on this story. And then in terms of the 2018, okay, so I was thinking about this book forever. I really started typing in 2019. And at that point in time, it was just kind of set now. But now, by 2020, became a very fraught thing. Like, what now are we talking about? What's our reality? So I had this brilliant idea that what I was going to do was move it back to 2018 so COVID wouldn't be looming. And then in the last quarter or so of the book, we actually skip ahead a few years. And so I was like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that part in 2022 when COVID will surely be completely over. And so then, as 2022 was bearing down and I'm editing the book and I was like, crap, and I can't move it further into the future because who knows what the future looks like. So I had to go in and like put masks on everybody and change, anytime it said like, she smiled, I had to be like, she seemed to smile from what I could tell from her eyes above her mask. Then I was in copy edits and it was March of 22 and I was writing about March of 22. And then New Hampshire went and lifted its mask mandate. So then I went through and took the masks off half the people, but not everybody. It's like, needless work. But by the time I sat down to write in 2019, Me Too, all that huge tangle of Me Too stuff had been on my mind for quite a while, as it had been with most of us. And that included looking back for a lot of us on school. So that was part of my own thinking about all of this. As that time went on, it was even more on my mind, and there is more of a specifically Me Too plotline later in the book, really literally hashtag Me Too, Twitter kind of plotline. But it just kind of, I think it ended up being a product of the time in which I wrote it. This is not a book that would have come out the same if I'd written it finished it in 2017.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, kind of related to that, one of the things I love about Bodhi is, she's kind of a warrior for justice in coming back to this school and facilitating these students pursuing their podcasts, some of which end up being true crime podcasts, and this particular one being about Thalia Keith, her roommate. But in this whole milieu, when she's looking back at her high school and looking back at the boys who did things that were completely egregious, that they should have been expelled for, and teachers and so on, she, in her present day, she's not above lying. She's not above performing a sort of semi-seduction and she's certainly not above flattering men in kind of in a little bit of fun retribution for maybe men who can't see their own egos or can't see beyond themselves.
Yeah.
So that was a really fun piece that you put into Bodhi, and I'm just wondering if she was a fun character for you to write.
Yeah, very fun. I think just like a little bit chaotic. And of course the character evolves over time. In the earliest iterations of her, she was way too put together, and she started out too far down the path of knowing something was fishy about the case and wanting to look into it. I wasn't giving her enough runway, basically. And because you really need a character to change over the course of a story, right? I'm always looking when I read for what is a character capable of at the end of the story that they weren't capable of at the beginning. And that could be good or bad. It could be like they're capable of murder by the end, or they're capable of standing up for themselves by the end. If I started her kind of going, yeah, I always thought there was something really funny about this case, we should look into it, and her life is really together, and she just kind of stayed that way, it really wasn't working. So I needed to back her way up from that understanding. And I also needed to find ways to help her kind of come unglued a little bit. So that, without too much spoiler here, the things that give her life stability at the beginning of the book, a lot of them are stripped away just within that 2 weeks that she's back there on that campus. And I needed to find someone essentially who had been really really adrift as a teenager. I mean, we all are, but maybe her more than some others. And then is theoretically really put together as an adult, so that when she steps back onto that high school campus and into that mindset, she's pulled between those two poles and really is ultimately pulled back for a minute at least towards her younger, more vulnerable self. But it's a strange process, I think, for me, always in creating a character. I know that there are writers, and I don't know if you're one of them, there are writers who really start with a very strong idea of character, like they could just hear this person, they know who they are, and then they have to figure out what that person's going to do. And for me, I basically you almost always start knowing what the plot is, and then I have to sort of reverse engineer who's the character who's going to be the most susceptible to this and the most changed by this, the most vulnerable to these circumstances.
Would you read to us a little bit?
I would love to. I used to read from the very opening, and I got really tired of that. So now that I'm on paperback tour, I'm reading from farther on. What I'm going to read to you, she's come back, basically, as I said, she's come back and she's teaching this class, and this is her first day of this podcasting class. And these students are, for the most part, really put together. They already know what they want to do their podcast on. And then so they've been going around the room talking about it, but we're about to meet this one person. So as they go around, only one demurred. Britt, an intense girl with long caramel hair, who would have struck me as a typical golden child Granby student of my own era, loose cashmere sweater, cute jeans, genetically blessed cheekbones, if it weren't for the Ankh tattoo on her inner wrist and the way she talked with no embarrassment about clinical depression when we first went around. Her voice was dry and deep, somewhere between a smoker's and a 50-year-old lawyer's. She shrugged when it was her turn. I'm torn between a few ideas. After class, she hung back near the door, and I'm skipping a little bit there. Britt said, looking at the floor and then over my shoulder. Okay, this is no offense, but I know you do a lot of true crime on your podcast, and I think it's a problematic genre. She waited as if I were supposed to repent. I said, that comes up, but we're following the workings of the Hollywood studio system, not chasing gore. I'm concerned about the tropes of true crime, the way it's turned into entertainment. That's sharp of you, I said. It's definitely a matter of approach. When we fetishize things. Right, no, I listened to your podcast, and I get, even when you did the Patricia Douglas thing or the Black Dahlia thing, I get that it's more about structures, and like I said, no offense, I see so much fetishizing, and I don't want to be another white girl giggling about murder. I said, most violent crime is remarkably boring. I pulled out a chair and sat back down, gestured to Britt to do the same, but she didn't answer, just stood tugging her backpack straps. I went into my panelist answer. The vast majority of murders are two young men getting into an altercation, one kills the other. You dig deep on unsolved crimes, or quote-unquote interesting crimes, and most of what you find is a man killing his partner. So either you talk structural racism, domestic violence, policing issues, or you end up picking one story that's interesting in specific ways, usually in ways that break those molds. One concern is that those cases are misrepresentative. And sure, there's a temptation to sensationalize things. I expected to find her glazed over, but she wasn't blinking. Are you interested in pursuing this as a subject? Britt said, also me as a white person, if I wanted to tell the story of a white person's murder, then I'm ignoring the violence done to black and brown bodies. But I can't tell a story of violence against people of color because I'm white, and that would be appropriation. She sounded frustrated. I shouldn't have been surprised that she talked like an Oberlin freshman who cared deeply but hadn't fully worked things out. I used to teach undergrads, after all. But it felt so incongruous here at Granby, where we'd all once spoken with such blithe, hurtful carelessness. And hadn't that just been yesterday? I said, I really don't think that's appropriation. And honestly, this is for a small audience. I gestured at the bare trees outside the window, hoping Britt would see what I did, that we were in the woods, not, as it certainly felt to a 12th grader, at the center of the universe. She said, in that email, and this is an email Bodhi sent with possible topics related to the history of Granby. In that email, you had two murders, the one from the 70s and the one from the 90s. I was thinking I'd do one of those, but I could feel my pulse in my neck. It was like being a child in an audience as the magician asked for volunteers, utterly terrified he'd pick you, but also thrilled he might. Whether I could admit it or not, I wanted this girl to look directly at Thalia's death in a way I myself couldn't, out of closeness, out of trauma, out of the irrational fear that my former classmates would think me presumptuous. No, that Thalia herself would somehow find me presumptuous. And at the same time, and for some of those same reasons, I wanted to stop her. I regretted putting Thalia on the list. I thought I could maybe steer Britt toward Barbara Crocker in 1975, the boyfriend they found hiding in the woods right near campus, his remarkably light sentence. But Britt said, I know you were friends. I'm sorry? You and Thalia Keith. Okay, so I take journalism, and we have access to the Sentinel archives. I got into the story last year, and I read everything from the paper, and I did the deep dive online, all the Reddit boards. You found my name on Reddit? No, I mean, you were quoted in the Sentinel, and I Googled everyone quoted there to see what had happened to them, and you were easy to find. And then they announced you were coming here, and I was like, whoa. Britt began chewing the cap of her green pen. I said, we were assigned as roommates for most of junior year, but we weren't friends. Britt said, if you're okay with it, of the two cases, I'd want to do Thalia Keith. It would be easier. I mean, there's teachers I could interview, and maybe you, but I still wonder how problematic this is. I said, the fact that you're asking is a sign you'd do this thoughtfully and responsibly. I was just self-aware enough at this point to clock that I was talking Britt into it and to wonder why. She nodded, chewed the pen cap. I said, it's up to you, but remember to consider scope, what you can do in 2 or 3 episodes. Britt extracted the pen cap and said, I think the wrong guy is in prison. Interesting, I said, non-committal. I should have guessed this was where she was headed. I said, I'm looking forward to this.
Awesome, thank you. It was so interesting to me that you, the class that she's teaching is a podcasting class. This was not the class she was originally brought on to teach. She was brought on to teach a film class, and she herself proposed, I could teach them a little bit about podcasting. Mm-hmm. She herself is a podcaster and a pretty successful one. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me, and you never talk about it in the book, but she had survived the murder of her roommate and all of the fallout after that. And she doesn't explicitly say that the podcast that she's doing as an adult might have something to do. She might have landed there because of what she'd lived through.
Yeah, and I don't think she would have thought of that, at least at the beginning of this book, right?
Right.
That was something that she felt like she had no right to any grief because they had not been friends, or even any right to feel really, all that rattled because she wasn't, she had nothing to do with what was going on.
Right, they were roommates.
They had been roommates the previous year.
Yeah,
the previous year, and they weren't friends. And so she feels like, this is not her tragedy, this is not her thing. Mm-hmm. But then, her focus within film history is the abuses of women by that Hollywood studio system in the early 20th century. And I would imagine that, if we fleshed out, the 2,000-page version of this, her full life, there have been other things along the way that have made her interested in, structural issues surrounding women. But yeah, there's probably definitely a connection. There's something she's at least subconsciously trying to work through.
Yeah. And one of my favorite things about the book is the way that 2018 Bodhi, 40-year-old Bodhi coming back to Granby, she can look back and she can see the issues that may have gone just horribly wrong with the 1995 case that was brought against Omar Evans. The convenient one black man in the entire community.
Right.
So there are issues of race, there are issues of class, privilege. A lot about institutions protecting themselves.
Yes.
A lot about a police force that might have been a little too easily influenced. Mm-hmm. So all of these 2018 awarenesses are coming into it. And then juxtapose that with the 1995, during the investigation, it's a terrible investigation. Nothing's locked down, not even the crime scene. Mm-hmm. The kids are all talking to each other. The teachers are all talking to each other. So one of my favorite parts of the book really is the way that all of the people coming together to kind of build a narrative. Whether they're trying to do something, nefarious or not, that can take on a life of its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was everything that I work on thematically. It's just kind of boiling away subconsciously. It's not like I have the red string on the bulletin board going from one theme to the other or something, but. There's a lot going on here about the way we tell stories, and the way we tell stories individually, and then the way we tell stories collectively, and the way that memory is so influenced by collective remembering, for better or worse. And again, I say this vaguely so it's not spoilery. There are a lot of instances, especially early on. And what's happened in the past of people pooling their memories in a very unhelpful way and coming up with a common narrative. But then towards the end of the book, there's also some very helpful ways that people are pooling their memories, where you don't really know the full story until you get multiple people's points of view, and there might be some missing pieces in some of that. So it's not like I'm trying to say all one thing, like collective memory equals bad, but it's just... Right. It's messy, right? How we do that.
Absolutely. I mean, kind of the beauty of the 2022 section of the book, the last quarter, I guess, of the book, is that so much of what Bodhi thinks she knows of what was happening in 1995 turns out to be a lot more complicated.
Yes.
And not just surrounding the murder and the investigation, but the entire life of the student body on the Granby campus. So.
Yeah, it's right. I was working a lot. I was thinking a lot about how teenagers are simultaneously inexperienced and kind of, just it's a developmental necessity, but self-centered, and they're going to miss a lot or not understand a lot. And at the same time, they are so perceptive and so absorbent. And I think back on. Just, things that I guess I'll say, I have had a couple experiences, partly because I'm, very much in touch with my own high school. On the one hand, things that I really thought, we thought these two teachers were dating, or we thought this other thing was happening, and turned out to be completely false. And a couple other things where I really thought something, we all kind of knew that this one teacher was really sketchy. And then I came back as an adult with my husband to the same campus and went, oh my God, what were we thinking of? He's lovely. Turns out I was right the first time. And you go, okay, we were onto something. We knew, we noticed. We had that maybe, sixth sense that kids need for survival, or just, a lot of time on your hands. I don't know. But so I was interested in playing with that a lot. To what extent do you look back and go, oh, we thought all this stuff, we were really naive. This is clearly not right. And to what extent were you, maybe right the first time?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think, looking at this book, we haven't talked yet about the fact that Bodhi was originally from Indiana, and she leaves that behind gladly, and as far as we know, never returns. But I was thinking...
I don't think she does.
Never returns. But I was thinking about the fact that she leaves Indiana, then she leaves Granby, then she leaves LA, and comes back to Granby, and all of the leave taking.
Yeah.
I see this in this book, and then also in some of your past books. But could you talk about that?
I mean, I think I'm always, for one, it's not necessarily that I need to always write about people who leave things behind, but of course, you want to write about the pivotal moments in someone's life, which might be when they're leaving one place and heading someplace new. I think she's someone, like I said, who, is, I think, kind of constantly, the way I see it is that up until the start of this book, her life has always been about moving forward. So she left Indiana for this much better place, but then that was miserable in its own ways, and she left that for a number of other places, and then has really, in LA, she's really found herself. This is where she is. And that this is the first time that we know of in her life that she's really taken a step back to go back to a place from her past. And I think that, if she were someone who was, had never left the town she grew up in, if she left the school and went back to Indiana, I think that would have a very different effect, right? She's very insistent on climbing that ladder out of some really miserable childhood, and then to go back down it is very, very frightening for her.
Absolutely. Well, this has really been fascinating, and I know that there will be a lot of questions from the audience too. But before we get to that, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you're working on next.
Yeah. So I told her earlier, she asked if she could ask this, and I was like, yes, but I'm going to answer really cryptically. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm not really saying the full topic, but the book that I'm writing now, it's historical fiction in kind of in the same way that this is crime fiction, like not interested in that as a genre. It just happens to be set in the past, set in the U.S. in 1938. So I would say it's like World War II adjacent, but obviously it's the U.S. and World War II hasn't started yet, so not a World War II novel. And this is the first time that I've written about real events in the life of a real person. I have, dealt with historical fiction in various ways before, but that fact that it's following real events it's very interesting. It's both very helpful and also very frustrating, because on the one hand, I have my outline handed to me. This is what happened over these couple of months. On the other, that's very limiting because I can't just have people do whatever is convenient, and there are weird gaps of time, like, oh, well, this next thing doesn't happen for a week, so now I have to find something for them to do in the meantime. Whereas if I were totally making it up, I would just have it be the next day, and I can't really do that. So it's a lot of research, a lot of getting hung up on like, I got to stop everything in the middle of the sentence to figure out, could you call on the phone from a hotel room in 1938? And then I'm going to do an hour of research and then finally go back and finish this one sentence. So that's kind of where I am. But it's fun. I am very into the project, and I actually feel like it's a very, very important project. To me, at least. Maybe not to anyone else, but it's important to me. So
that's fabulous. Well, I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. So I think we have a microphone
right there
back here. If anybody has questions that they'd like to ask Rebecca.
It always takes one person getting up first and being the brave one to walk to the microphone. It takes a minute. There we go. Yeah.
I'm conveniently located. I'm going to ask a great believers question.
Sure, please.
So I just finished it recently, and it was such a hard book to read, and I just sort of fell in love with all the characters, and I'm still really shaken up about the whole thing. And so I was shaken up about the whole thing, but I didn't spend years writing it. So I was just wondering how can you, and I'm not a fiction writer,
right?
But how can you create these people who are amazing and idiosyncratic, and then kill them all?
Yeah, don't kill them all. To be clear,
not all, but even the ones you don't kill, they're,
I know what you mean.
They're so tortured and
yeah. And for people who don't know about the Great Believers, it's about the AIDS epidemic in Chicago in the 1980s. So it's a heavy subject, and it would be very misrepresentative if everyone came out unscathed. So I don't know. What I'll say is, the heaviest part for me was the research, most of which was interviews with survivors, because there was very little to next to nothing written about Chicago specifically in the AIDS epidemic, and I needed that that was the, setting I'd chosen. I needed to get those details right. And I really ended up in a therapist relationship with a lot of these people, like met multiple times, and then they would email and be like, I thought of more stuff to tell you. And I'm like, well, I'm actually I'm done, but it became, it was a real, really important relationship that I built with a lot of different people. And, often sitting there crying with people. For me, what was interesting, I basically had instantaneous art therapy. Think about the way people take trauma and make art out of it. I just, everything I needed to process, I could put into this book. And that didn't mean literally people's stories. I wasn't, I had my own characters. I wasn't doing that. But those emotions, they were always usable in this way that then was also a processing of those. And then also, this is a weird one, but when you write a book, you don't just, write it really, really slowly one time through and then you're done, right? You're skipping around, and then maybe I've written, the last moments of someone's life, but then I'm still going back and working on chapter 4, and I can still add material with that person. They're still living to me for, months and months and months as I work on the book. So if that makes sense, it was definitely, it's not like I was sitting there unemotionally, callously writing this book, but the fact that I was writing it was more of a help than you might think, actually. Yeah.
So I'm really glad you chose that portion to read, because one of the things that I hear as a through line in a lot of this conversation is this line between appropriation and what's the word you use in that excerpt? She says that Bodhi says she was presumptuous to tell Talia's story.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I loved, and I'm an historian, so I always read acknowledgments and things like this. One of the things I loved about The Great Believers is you said that you found that there's a very narrow line between appropriation and allyship. And this is something that I kind of read into. I have some questions for you, and it kind of sounds too like something that you're working through with your new project.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously, as an author of fiction, you probably think a lot about what's yours and what's not. But I was wondering if you could share a little bit about how you do that balancing act.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Right. Because this is the thing. We've been having really important, really helpful conversations in the past, especially past 5 to 10 years, in all of the arts and in fiction, about that question of appropriation, who can tell what stories. All of those questions, those conversations have made me a better writer. I'm really grateful for them. And I'll say the thing is, if you're writing a novel, you're going to be writing about people other than yourself, right? People demographically different from yourself. If I wrote an entire novel and filled it with nothing but white, college-educated, straight women in their 40s, that would be bananas. And also, at a certain point, it would be erasure, right? If I never have anyone who's differently abled, if I can't have any characters of color because I'm too scared of that. That's a problem. So the question is, how do you do this well? Because if you're going to write a novel, you're going to do this. And of course, certain books are going to engage with that more, right? To write The Great Believers, and I'm writing very much across difference and about lived history that is not my own, and that has been a marginalized history in so many ways. That is just more fraught than including one character who's of a different nationality or something, right? So it's just you gotta be really careful. You have to do your legwork, you have to do your research, you have to run it by the people who are gonna be honest with you about whether you misstepped, whether you got it right, what you need to change. And so those are things that I do. That's one way that those conversations have made me a better writer, because I think, you go back 20, 30, 40 years, you find writers who kind of had the hubris of well, I'm just going to guess what women's lives are like, and I'm sure I've got it right. And they clearly never talked to a woman about any of this stuff, right? And writers working now, if we're paying attention, are much more likely to be okay, I need to interview a lot of people. I need to have readers before this goes to my editor who are going to tell me, and then readers after my editor who are going to tell me, what did I get wrong? And I got to be humble about that, and I got to be open to that. So yeah, The book that I'm writing now, in terms of like it being a real person, I do not have the concerns you would think someone would, because this person is dead, had no descendants, and was a horrible human being. So I am just not concerned about like anyone being upset about my treatment of them. So, but there are other characters actually in the book, other real people that I probably need to be a little bit aware of. The great-grandchild or whatever who's going to show up on my porch.
So all the writers in the audience, take note.
Only write about terrible dead people.
Exactly.
No. Other questions? Oh, we have, awesome.
So I haven't read any of your books, but
That's okay.
I've heard from my mom about how good they are.
Aww.
And when I get older,
Yes.
that's when I want to read them. And I like to write stories.
Ooh.
I was wondering, do you have any advice for be a writer?
Yeah, I do. I'm so happy that you like to write. That's amazing. I already really loved to write by the time I was your age. And I really just never stopped. I could give you like 75 pieces of advice, but I'm going to stop myself from doing that. I'm going to tell you like 3 things. One of them is, the most obvious advice that people are ever going to give you. Everyone's going to say, well, if you want to be a writer, you need to read a lot. And of course that's true, and I bet you already read a lot. But what's fun about that, what people don't always explain, is when you're reading a lot, you can really take the time to notice what the author did. I really liked rereading books and going back and trying to figure out why the author, why did they start the story where they started it? Out of any time in this whole story, why did they start it then? And what character did they start with and why? So that's kind of really fun to do. Another thing I would say is, as a kid and as a teenager, I got so much out of doing theater, because theater, whether you're running the spotlight or you're acting or whatever, you're living the same story again and again and again and again every night to rehearse. And you learn that story inside and out and how characters work and why people move in a certain way. It can be really helpful. And then the last thing I'll say is, do not listen to anyone who tells you that people can't make a living in the arts, because that is wrong. I know, people, it might not be that everyone just you can't just graduate from college and go and be a successful author the next day, but people do make a living writing books, people make a living editing books, people make a living teaching writing. And so if someone tells you that you need to that can only be a hobby, and you should really be a business major instead, unless you really wanted to be a business major, that's not the truth. So, and there are a lot of people out there who really, really love to tell kids that, and I don't know why, because it's wrong. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So I know being an author is your job, so you know when you go into a book that someone's going to read it. And so how does that relationship between knowing that someone else is going to read it both expand and maybe restrict your creative process?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? Because, the first book, you're I don't know if anyone's ever going to see this, which of course the downside of that would be, how do I justify going and leaving my baby at home on a Saturday with my husband, not alone, but with my husband, and, going to the coffee shop for 3 hours to work on this book when I don't know if maybe this is just a weird hobby. I don't know if anyone's ever going to read this. But you also have that freedom of not feeling like people are automatically going to read it. I will say my first book, I didn't know if anyone would read it. My second novel, I'd started before my first one was anywhere near published, so I had already started that. And my third book was stories that I'd written mostly before. So it wasn't until I sat down to start The Great Believers, my fourth book, that I was I am starting a novel that people are going to read, oh God. And that was scary. I think one thing that happens later, though, too, is that you know that you have a safety net of how many people are going to stop you. if it's really bad. So like my agent's going to stop me, editors are going to stop me. It's not like I'm sitting there and it's automatically instantly published into the world, unless unless I'm writing on Twitter or something. But like my actual work. So that does help. Is that there's much just kind of more of an awareness of like I'm not going to be judged on even my finished draft because it's going to go through so much editing with so many other pairs of eyes on it before it'll go out into the world. So that helps to not feel like, someone's looking over my shoulder somehow.
Hi, I actually have a bit of a follow-up question to that. I am a journalist, and I'm always telling the reporters that I work with, if you're making this piece of journalism for everyone, you're making it for no one. And think really carefully about who something is for and why they should care. So I'm wondering, you as a fiction writer, if you think about who your target audience is, how that changes with each book, if that's something that you think about.
Ooh, yeah, that's a great question. I love the first part of what you said. That is absolutely true. You try to like write the most palatable thing and you end up with just like oatmeal mush. It's not going to be good. It's a great question. There's no one ideal reader that I have. I'm not picturing a certain person or even a certain type of person. And I know that there are writers who really feel like, my sister is my audience and I just think about her or something like that. I don't think my sister actually reads my books. That would really not. So I think it just, for me, it's more like, is this book finding its own iteration, right? Like this book wants to be a certain shape. It wants to be about a certain thing. It wants to make certain points. This book has questions to ask of me that I need to dig deeper on. So I'm kind of more interested in that. Like, can it find its own shape? Rather than who is going to like this or who's going to... And of course, you get down into editing, and there is that question of like, is this understandable? Is this too long? Is this relatable? And maybe you fine-tune. But for me, that doesn't come in until close to the end, which the great thing is then essentially I'm writing for myself. And I am a very specific audience. And I'm really... most of the time I'm just trying to entertain myself. It's really... And I don't know, I think there are writers absolutely who, it's not that they're trying to write for everybody, but their interest really is commercial, right? Like their main goal is how many copies of this can I sell? I want to just entertain people, make them happy. And that's great. And there are some amazing writers who write like that. What I write gets called literary fiction, which is not to say that other stuff isn't literary, but when I'm pressed to define that, it's kind of like, well, it's like the stuff that's not for everybody. It's like it can be like the weird art. It can be like the weird music that is going to be somebody's favorite thing, hopefully someone with really good taste. But it's not like the pop song that is, going to be for everybody. So basically, I'm just agreeing with the first part of what you said. That's all I'm really saying here.
Well, Rebecca, thank you.
We have one more question. I'd really love to hear if we can. Yeah, we can have one more. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Just another question about your writing process. What was it like to write a murder mystery and actually get the logistics of the mystery figured out? And at what point in the writing process did all that kind of fall into place? And how natural was it versus researched and
yeah.
I don't know. What was that like as someone who's not normally doing that kind of thing?
Yeah. That's a great question. I do, speaking of commercial writers, I do have quite a few friends who are real mystery novelists, detective series, right? One book a year. And one thing I have heard so many of them say is that it really, really helps to know from the outset exactly what happened the night it all went down. Just because you're going to save you're going to waste a lot of time if you don't know, and then you have to redo your timelines and get people in the right place and figure it all out later. So I'd been thinking about the book for a long time, but basically as I was sitting down to go, okay, I'm about to start typing, maybe started doing a little like a few sentences of writing, I basically backed up and said, okay, I'm going to do a timeline of that night, every single thing that happened, how far apart these buildings were. And I knew from the very beginning who did it, how it happened, the little, clues that would lead us there in the end. I had that worked out completely from the beginning. And I'm glad, because otherwise I'd still be writing it. So that's a good one to end on.
All right, there we go. And I did see on your Substack that you actually drew a map of the Granby campus.
Yeah, well, the version you saw, I did not draw, to be clear.
Okay.
So I had many different like envelope back, bad drawings. And then the Penguin marketing team, they're getting ready to like send out the early kind of influencer copies of the book. And they were like, did you ever draw a map? And I said, yeah, but I can't draw. And they're like, oh, no, don't worry, we're going to give it to the art department. So they had me, I did like a nicer, kind of clearer, official version with a little key. And then they had this like watercolor artist do this beautiful version. And they sent out these maps with the influencer ones. But it's also on my website. So if you want to see, in my mind, what the Granby campus looks like, you can look at my website. And it's way better than I could ever draw, which is very nice.
Awesome. Rebecca, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been so much fun.